Thank you everyone for joining this AI Frontiers webinar. As a quick introduction, AI Frontiers is a series of seminars showcasing the range of interdisciplinary research and innovation at King's College London. As part of the series, we're delighted to share that over the coming months, we'll be showcasing the research of our AI Plus Fellows, a talented cohort of researchers recruited as part of a major strategic investment in interdisciplinary excellence in artificial intelligence at King's. We'll have more announcements about these appointments in the future, but ahead of that, we're excited to welcome Rob Laidlaw, one of the first fellows to start in post. I'll now hand it over to the chair, Professor Elaine Chu, to kick off the seminar. Up to you, Elaine.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Rob Laidlaw's talk. And we're so pleased to have Rob with us here at King's. As you may know, we now have a Music and Acoustics Research Center. And of course, we've invited Rob to join, which is concerned with music and acoustics, music science, technology, and medicine. And so Rob's work fits right into this from a very creative and sophisticated perspective. And I'm especially glad that Rob has joined us because I've actually heard some of Rob's pieces. He has made some of the cutting edge top flight pieces of music for orchestra with the BBC Philharmonic, for Radio 3, BBC Radio 3, as well as the Berlin Radio Symphony Orchestra. So I can't wait to hear more about how he made these pieces and his vision for going forward with music and AI.
Thank you very much, Elaine. That's a really lovely introduction. And yeah, it's really wonderful to be here at King's and to join the music department, the Institute for Artificial Intelligence, and the Music and Research Centre as Music and Acoustic Research Centre, as Elaine points out. And I will mention the project with Radio 3 and the Berlin Radio Symphony later, so your wish will be fulfilled, or at least partly. So just to give a tiny bit of background on me before we jump in, I studied composition at the Royal Academy of Music before going on to do a PhD at the Royal Northern College of Music, looking at artificial intelligence in the creative process of contemporary classical music. And after that, I was at Oxford for a 3-year career development fellowship, and I've just joined King's last month. So I've always worked with a lot of interdisciplinary ideas in my compositional work. I've worked with lots of computer scientists and programmers, as you'll see in this talk, and other kinds of scientists as well, astronomers, engineers, all sorts like that. I find that interdisciplinary connection is really valuable creatively and produces some, I think, useful artistic research. So I'm delighted to be continuing that at King's. I didn't start out as a classical composer, actually. I was a jazz player until I was in my early 20s, and then I started writing more notated music for ensembles. And before that, I actually played synthesizers and iPads in pop and rock bands when I was in school. So I've sort of always been interested in playing around with beeps and boops, as it were. Okay, so I'll just jump straight into this talk now. So I'm not entirely sure what our audience is here, and probably there's lots of different audiences going on. So I'm not quite sure how much everyone has encountered this field of AI and music before. So I just want to begin with asking quite a straightforward question that's nonetheless going to inform the rest of the talk, which is, why might someone be interested in studying AI and music? Or what are the different facets to this relationship that have continually attracted artists, researchers, and listeners to take an interest? Well, there are lots of reasons, because AI and machine learning in music is not just one thing. It's a whole host of approaches to making and thinking about sound. And recent text-to-music commercial models are just one. This range is one reason that the field is so sprawling, heterogeneous, and fast-moving. However, the first and I think main reason why people are interested has to be that it's fun. On the whole, people like music and people like computers, and the earliest experiments in AI and music came, in many senses, out of a sense of joy taken in applying one field to another, just kind of playing around. This is the earliest known recording of music performed by a computer in 1951 on Manchester University's Ferranti Mark I computer.
Another one coming up.
Wrong cutting.
And you can hear in the background that they at least seem to be enjoying themselves. People had been having fun, however, with music and algorithms or music and machines for centuries before the invention of computers. The 18th century was home to a wide variety of musical dice games. Oops, sorry. Oh my God, it's gone rogue. Musical dice games based in the concept of ars combinatoria, which allowed you to throw dice and construct musical pieces from the results. These algorithmic, or at least probabilistic games were widely popular and consumed by the public, so in a way they're almost like forerunners of today's systems, which similarly allow non-expert users to algorithmically create music in their own homes. People have also always enjoyed machines that make music or imitate human music making in some way. The 19th century, for example, was full of musical automata, including contraptions like Vaucanson's mechanical flautist and Meltzer's automatic orchestra, the panharmonicon. Meltzer was best known for producing early metronomes, but his panharmonicon attracted the interest of Beethoven, who even composed a work called Battle Symphony for the machine and then later orchestrated for orchestra. Unfortunately, this work was not very well received, with one attendee describing it as seemingly designed to make the listener as deaf as its composer. However, I think Beethoven at least was having a good time. So I think that everyone or most people who are interested in AI and music began by enjoying playing around with music and systems, and some stopped there, many stopped there, with private experiments carried out for the benefit of themselves and their friends, and some go on to do very different things in their careers as artists and researchers with this technology. There's also a strong history of people using algorithms to test how far human creativity can be rationalized. Are there rules to the secret of creativity? And if there are, can a computer learn them? This is a big driver in many areas of research, particularly those that are led by computer scientists who have a love of music and believe in it as a challenge, a possibly insurmountable challenge, to try computers against. Although there are, of course, many artists who come at it from the other side of this, so to speak, as well. One of the first experiments in using a computer to generate an entirely new piece of music came in 1957, and this is the relatively well-known Iliac suite created by Lejar and Hiller and Leonard Isaacson on the Iliac 1 computer. These pieces were created by the computer generating notes and intervals and checking that music against rules, discarding generations which breached the rules. Hiller's paper on the project states, "By standards such as these, it is possible, at least in theory, to construct tables of probabilities describing a musical style, or perhaps even the style of an individual composer." The idea of whether a computer could learn the probabilities inherent in a particular composer's style was later taken further. David Cope, American researcher and composer who died recently in 2025, developed his Emmy program in the early 80s to emulate existing composers, including himself. But of course, this area of the field has really exploded since the recent big data-fueled machine learning boom. Even as far back as the 17th century, however, we know that people were thinking about whether algorithms could generate pieces of music and creating systems to do so. Athanasius Kircher wrote a detailed and highly ordered mathematical system to compose music in his 1650 work Musurgia Universalis. He, along with most others at the time, believed that there were definite and distinct relationships between emotions and specific musical choices, and thus he was able to propose a system where one could not only generate music, but it was music that functioned to affect particular emotions in listeners. Or in other words, users could provide a kind of non-musical prompt for the system to aim towards, though not quite in natural language as we see today. Ada Lovelace, mathematician and musician, didn't seem to think that the secrets of composing truly new music could be learned by systems when she wrote about the possibilities of Babbage's proposed analytical engine in 1843, and she wrote that the machine would never really truly be able to originate anything, although she didn't really elaborate on what originate meant. Nonetheless, she was keen to try it out anyway. This interest leads to another that has driven parts of the field forward in many ways. Even if a computer can't rationally explain the secrets of human creativity, are there things about music that they can tell us that we might have missed? This is often less about generating music and more about analyzing it, although the distinction is not always an important one since generative systems usually need to analyze anyway. And this is the basis of lots of research happening in the music information retrieval field, and indeed there's a wide range of original work happening in this area right here across various departments at King's, as Elaine mentioned earlier. This talk, however, focuses primarily on composition and performance, so I'll move on to practitioners. One of the things that has attracted artists recently and historically to this field is the capacity for algorithms and systems to inspire new sounds with which musicians can go on to innovate their practice. Sounds that nobody has ever heard before have always been deployed and of interest to experimental musicians, and AI-related sounds fit into this mold. There are countless examples, so just to name a few, Holly Herndon's 2019 album Proto, which you can see at the top, uses a neural network called Spawn to generate samples based on her audiences. I think that's her audiences at concerts provided the data sets. While Vicky Clark's Aura machine at the bottom uses machine learning to re-engage with sounds of industrial processes in Manchester. Pianist Zubin Kanga's 2023 work, Meta Memory, blurs his own past performances together into something new. And a fast-growing field is in musical instruments that have AI embedded within them as a means of exploring new sounds and performance, which I'll return to later on in the presentation. There's also the attraction of discovering new ways of organizing sounds. So this often means that audiences may not actually be hearing sounds or samples that are generated by algorithms or AI, but the way that they are put together results from that experimentation and inviting that into the creative process. A 20th century example might be the music of Nan Caro for player pianos, and he's looking particularly jolly at the top left in this photo, which are automatic pianos that performed with rolls that acted like punch cards. While they behave like pianos, Nan Caro wrote music that was highly rhythmically complex and wouldn't have been possible for human musicians, but was possible on player pianos. And he was doing this as early as the late 1930s, I think, certainly by the 40s. Greek composer and architect Ioannis Xenakis later developed a huge variety of stochastic computer systems for music and applied this thinking to some of his large-scale orchestral work. Manchester-based composer Emily Howard at the bottom there explores mathematical and topological shapes to inform the development of her works, even while the material for those works themselves is developed by her alone. And Ted Moore's 2021 work Quartet, I think, is a really great example, which you can see at the top right partly. You can see it on YouTube and Vimeo as well. In his words, recordings of music ensemble players I made were then subjected to data analysis using audio descriptors and machine learning algorithms using Flucoma. Approaching these acoustic and electronic sounds as data for comparison and manipulation offered me new strategies for combining the material in expressive ways, finding form, and creating sonic relationships and audio-visual objects that I wouldn't otherwise consider. I really like this direction of working with or against algorithms on a structural, more abstracted level of compositional performance than just the sonic surface and finding things that you wouldn't otherwise consider. Improvising with machines has also provided fertile artistic grounds for decades. Composer George Lewis has been upgrading his Voyager system since the late 80s, which improvises in real time, although George himself has consistently questioned the distinction between composition and improvisation. Lewis has also written about how improvising with computers is important for telling us something about how humans interact with machines generally, which is relevant well beyond the concert hall stage. Jennifer Walsh's 2018 work Ultrachunk features an improvised duet between Walsh and an AI-generated digital twin of her face and voice. And indeed, recently, Elaine, who's kindly chairing this session, has performed with the improvising multi-agent system Somax 2 and its human controller, of course, at EarCam in Paris, which is well worth a listen. And Elaine has said that you're welcome to email her to get a link to hear that, which I'd recommend. Of course, in 2026, you can't discuss why people are interested in AI music without mentioning profit. Until recently, and indeed still for most experimental musicians, there's very little chance of making much money at all. However, recent text-to-music models have shown that there is demand for automating work that composers and performers have historically relied on. And this has an effect downstream on research environments and the encouragement of projects that could have a dual purpose as both artistic and commercial. In my own work, I'm principally interested in AI as a means of thinking about what music is and what it means to make music as a human. Lots of my work focuses on ways that technology cannot and perhaps can never capture what it means to make music as people. I want to understand how performance can be deployed as a space to interrogate our relationship with technologies and how incorporating musicians into the design process of creative AI tools can make these tools more interesting, at least to me, and engaging to artistic communities. And engaging and interesting in this context means for me understanding new forms of creative expression, but also broadening access to people who aren't technological or musical experts. So now I'd like to work through some examples of how AI and music intersect in 3 of my own projects. To identify, if you like, some of those many faces in the title of this presentation, not just in general terms, but also in specific. What are the different ways of working with AI here? How do they work architecturally? What do they sound like? And what kinds of aesthetic questions do they pose? If you're not too familiar with machine learning in this context, you might find this diagram helpful, which sort of splits it into data, design, and intent. We can think about it in terms of data, what data it needs, if any, the way that the system works under the hood, and ultimately what it is actually intended to do or function as. Tui is the name of a mimic songbird from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and also the name of a 2024 project in collaboration with the International Contemporary Ensemble in New York and colleagues at RNCM PRISM, the Center for Practice and Research in Science and Music, where I did my PhD. I was interested in how mimic songbirds, which incorporate learned sounds from their environment into their bird call, might give a different perspective on musical AI. Songbirds have very interesting neurological structures, and the way they put together sonic utterances is quite distinct from how we do. The project used a machine listening software, which was designed initially to listen for musical gestures played by human performers and then respond when it thought it had heard those gestures, in essence. I trained it on a TUI bird call, which actually came with a whole host of issues in terms of getting the thing to work with birds instead of humans. But anyway, I also transcribed the bird song for the performers, and the game of the piece was to hoodwink the software into responding as if it had heard the original bird, not human performers. It's a project that highlights and explores how machines hear differently to us. To achieve this, you are forced to be quite creative with the ways that musicians make sounds, and it calls on unusual instruments like a slide whistle or a bit of styrofoam, and unusual ways of playing instruments like growling into the flute or pressing the wrong fingerings on the clarinet. And from a compositional point of view, discovering these sort of new ways of performing in order to play the game of the piece was really quite exciting. So here's the original bird song, and then straight afterwards will be the ensemble performing the transcriptions. And Elaine, I'd appreciate it if you can't hear it, if you let me know again. So here's the bird call followed by the transcriptions. Uh-oh. And that's supposed to go around enough times for the system to sort of pick up that it's hearing a bird song, and then it triggers the next section of the piece. Or at least that's the idea. In 2023, I worked on a project called Post-Singularity Songs with soprano Stephanie Lampreia. This involves musical interpretations of creation myths assembled through working with a range of language models, both small and large. And in fact, Stephanie has recorded it onto an album, which you can see here, which is being released in a week or two. I was interested in looking at creation myths because of the way that some cultures have multiple myths that might relate to the same phenomenon. So they are, in one way of thinking, mutually exclusive, and yet this isn't really a problem most of the time. I wondered what relevance this approach to multiple things being true at the same time could have what relevance it had to questions like large language models' tendency to hallucinate alternative facts. So here's a little extract of the beginning of the piece.
Import flow as f, import tensor as t, input underscore dat equals open bracket apostrophe flow, apostrophe comma, apostrophe unity, apostrophe seamless, apostrophe close bracket. In the beginning, there was flow. This is agreed by all.
Steffi and I were also keen to explore a collaborative process with one another where there's less human agency behind the text. Would this make us more likely to impose our own artistic decisions on the text, and how does it affect the way she interprets ideas? These are the focus of a paper we're writing at the moment. I say less human agency because the whole text was still assembled by me in the edit, And some of it was based on long conversations we had with various large language models. But the most interesting to me came from a custom poetry generating neural network I designed with a very small data set that fine-tuned a larger model that already understood the basics of language. This produced my favorite text of the piece, which is this short poem. We loved working with this, and here's an extract of this part of the piece, which starts halfway through the text here and features just a really wonderful vocal performance by Stephanie. Just find the right point in the track. We also made a vocal clone of Stephanie's voice with a sample-by-sample neural synthesis algorithm. Again, this used a very small dataset, just some recordings of Stephanie. We were struck by how breathless and claustrophobic the generations were, and it feels like it's constantly inhaling, never exhaling. Of course, the network doesn't know what a human body is, so this isn't a problem for it to be constantly sounding like it's inhaling air and never getting rid of it. But it sounds very strange and inhuman to us. And you can hear this effect in the background of this part of the piece.
Now I tell it a clone of Pyrrhon, the navigator, who was made the mightiest in all parts of mind and purpose. It journeyed to the edge of the world through the labyrinth, even beyond that corrupt desolation where remain only faint echoes, this far, further.
My 2025 project, Techno Utopia, is a concerto for orchestra and soloists performing on piano, synthesizers, and AI-embedded instruments. It's a piece about individuality in the face of often oppressive systems, about what data can and can't capture, about the act of making, listening to, and loving music, and in finding new approaches to machine learning in an orchestral context. It's also a project where we wanted to show that you don't need the entire internet to train a versatile creative AI model. In this project, data was provided by my partner BBC Radio 3, and specifically I used Radio 3 recordings featuring the BBC Philharmonic, who along with the Berlin Radio Symphony are my cultural partners in this project. I had access to around 2,500 hours of orchestral broadcasts. Now, in one sense, this is a lot of data, and I certainly haven't listened to it all, but it's not a lot in comparison to the millions of hours used by commercial models trained on, say, the recording catalogs of major labels. And indeed, we didn't use all of that data, but it was useful to have it all so that we could select the bits that worked best for us. And it all comes from just one ensemble. So the data is not only sourced with permission, but it's also local data. It's site-specific. And any AI models trained in this project are responding directly to the ensemble I'm working with, not to a statistical sum of averages of the internet. There are lots of AI algorithms used in various ways throughout the nearly 40-minute piece, but the main ones are embedding them into instruments that the soloist, Zubin Kanga, who you might remember I mentioned his Meta Memory project earlier on, they're embedded into instruments that he performs on. At various points, machine listening is used to match the pitch Zubin is playing on piano with a moment from the archive with that pitch in it. Here's an example of this effect. I like both the moments where it sounds plausible to my ears and also the moments where you think, why has it chosen that snippet?
To perform Prokofiev's third piano concerto. And we open now with music.
I also wanted an entirely new instrument in the piece for Zubin to perform on that could sound like it was deconstructing the orchestra in front of our very ears. We trained an algorithm called Rave, which was created by Earcam on the BBC archive to create a multi-dimensional latent space. Creating a latent space is analogous, at least in this context, to creating a map of all the sounds. Each moment in the archive is analysed according to a number of dimensions. In this case, it was 8. And then, once this 8-dimensional map is created, you can reconstruct sounds or find new ones by providing a set of 8 coordinates and listening to what resides in that spot. What's interesting about Rave, and indeed about any latent space created by unsupervised machine learning, is that these dimensions don't always correspond neatly with things that we can hear as humans. If a person was categorizing sounds, one dimension might be volume, another might be pitch, a third might be which instrument is playing, and so on. Machine learning and machine listening analyzes music using statistical methods that are distinct from how we hear music. Nonetheless, I can guess as to roughly what the 8 dimensions of Rave trained on the BBC archive related to, according to my ears, and this itself is also a creative act and would be different for different people doing this exercise. You will notice that everything is entangled in multiple ways. Each dimension tends to relate to more than one musical parameter, not always parameters that we might associate with one another. At the same time, a single parameter like volume or pitch is actually affected by multiple dimensions at the same time. Musicians, though, like to feel like they are interacting with something tactile and not an abstract piece of software, like they are playing an instrument. So we needed something for this orchestral rave model to live inside, an instrument that can pass information intuitively to 8 dimensions. And we didn't find that the piano was particularly useful for this 8-dimensional aspect of it. So to do this, I collaborated and traveled to the Intelligent Instruments Lab at the University of Iceland. This is Nicola Provato, who studies interaction design and with whom I worked very closely on this project. The Stacco instrument that Nicola invented a couple of years ago, which you can see us constructing a version of here, has several magnetometers embedded within it. Magnetometers track the state of a magnetic field, and for this project we embedded 4 of them and tracked the perturbations of 4 magnets in 2 dimensions, x and y. So therefore we can extract 8 total streams of data from physically manipulating 4 magnets. Here you can see a scan of the Stacco instrument and the circles where the 4 magnets generally go. So because the streams of data from the magnets usually directly control the coordinates being sent into the latent space, you can see that I've drawn onto the surface of the instrument the relationship between each magnet and the dimensions it controls. We experimented with different relationships, bearing in mind that 2 magnets can be controlled by the same hand if desired, 1 magnet can control more than one dimension, and the scaling of magnetometer data to latent space coordinate does not need to be a linear relationship or consistent across the whole instrument. You can also see that the physical locations of sounds have been marked, like the circle in yellow, which shows a sector of the space where you can recreate something like the audience applause at the end of a BBC Philharmonic concert. So this is one instrument that the soloist performs on a Techno-Utopia, and in fact there's a cadenza moment where the Stacco performer sort of steals the music that the live real orchestra is performing and pulls it apart and reconstitutes it. So I'll show you a short video of me playing the Stacco, that's on the left, so you can see how it looks, and then I'll play the beginning of that cadenza from a recording with the BBC Philharmonic Orchestra last year. We also used parts of the archive in other ways that weren't really related to AI, but are also quite fun. So we cut it up into little chunks of music that the orchestra had performed before, and there were moments where the orchestra had to perform live, these extracts, and also Zubin was triggering the samples on the keyboard of the same music. So that's what this next section relates to, and see if you can hear the difference between the real orchestra and the sampled one from the archive, which is much more difficult when it's audio only and you can't see the orchestra. Yeah, it's quite a lot easier when you can see whether they're playing or not. Oops. Oh, there we are. So what are some of the many faces of creative AI in music, to return to the title of the talk? And where do the kinds of creative AI used by artists sit in comparison to more commercial models, which people have taken to calling generative AI or Gen AI recently? Well, one way to look at this is to think about where any given creative AI you might encounter sits on a few different spectra, or to keep the faces terminology going, maybe which face of a die it relates to. An obvious one, what kind of algorithm is it using? Is it using a transformer, some kind of machine listening, an audio generative diffusion network, a genetic algorithm, and so on? And while it's easy and therefore tempting to categorize creative AI according to architecture, it doesn't always tell us much about what the AI is intended to do, nor how it was trained. Yes, lots of commercial models might use a diffusion network, for example, but not all of them do. And equally, lots of very strange experimental work does as well. A more useful spectrum could be thinking about creative AI's function in music making. Is it intended to be like a composer, like a performer, like an instrument, or like a listener, or like some hybrid of these ideas? All of these functions have been the focus of really interesting work ever since the first experiments into music and computers in the 50s. They also provide lots of problematic questions to unpick. What is the difference between composition and improvisation for a computer anyway? On the other hand, it's not always clear what musical function a commercial Gen AI system model is intended to fulfill. They aren't really designed to play a role within music making, at least as most people would understand it, but rather automate the process itself somehow. So to zoom out, where does the creative AI sit on being within music making or without? You could also reframe this as automation and provocation. How far is a creative AI system intended to provoke a user, to disrupt their usual creative process, to enter into dialogue with musical ideas, to challenge their notions of how to perform music? And how far is it supposed to make a process automatic without human involvement? These aren't really opposites, because a system can easily be both at the same time, but it's sometimes an interesting way of thinking about these things. Something that's often pretty noticeable is the difference between creative AI models that involve artists in their design versus those that don't. You might be surprised at how many commercial musical AI systems are not designed in consultation with any musicians at all. Now, often several of the programming team will be great music enthusiasts and often very accomplished in some discipline like performing, DJing, singing, or another musical practice. However, in my view, it's a bit of a category error to imagine that that can fill the role of working with musical artists independent to your project. Projects with that external interrogation of what we are doing, who we're doing it for, why we're doing it, and so on, tend to be, in my view, much more creatively interesting than those without. There have also been recent studies that show that various interest groups, and not just artists, see meaningful artist involvement as necessary for ethical musical AI design. Dataset curation is a really interesting one. Historically, many AI models, of course, didn't need any data and learnt their rules through other methods. However, that's not usually the case today. So even in those that do use data, and lots of it, we've seen that careful curation of datasets has become an artistic process, something that involves intense thought around aesthetics and ethics. By contrast, many Gen AI models take a non-curated approach by design explicitly. They are designed to work with as much data as possible, regardless of what that music is. In my own research, I'm interested in what I'm calling the human-non-human spectrum. What does this mean? Well, most generative AI is explicitly designed to be anthropomorphic. It's designed to be trained on human work, make the kind of music humans already make, and conquer a human-made creative ecosystem, and ultimately to sound human. It's not the technology itself, I think, but this anthropocentrism that has made it such a controversial issue over the last couple of years, as the field has moved from a relatively fringe academic and experimental interest, or at least relatively unknown, to the mainstream. However, AI has been shown to have non-human characteristics, which in some fields they call superhuman across many fields. In competitive games, a famous example is the game of Go between Lee Sedol and AlphaGo. In move 37, AlphaGo made an inexplicable move that appeared to defy its human training data. After it won this game, this move was studied by human players to develop new Go strategies. However, there's not been much review of AI's non-human qualities when it comes to creative AI. And superhuman is really only a relevant term when an AI model can outperform a human expert. I don't think this is really relevant in music, the idea of outperforming. So we can also examine characteristics that AI simply cannot learn, areas in which they underperform, and characteristics that completely defy the way we make music as humans. And together, these are what I call non-human creative characteristics. You might have noticed that I've been interested in these already in previous projects, like in TUI, how machines don't listen the way that we do, and post-singularity songs. And in many ways in Techno-Utopia, although I'll return to this figure from earlier for one example. As discussed, the way that rave entangles information about music into its latent spaces is alien, even in 8 dimensions, let alone the hundreds, thousands, or millions of parameters that we might see in other models, types of architectures. By mapping these non-human entanglements onto a physical device, the project developed new methods for allowing musicians to leverage and explore AI's non-human qualities in pursuit of original creative approaches. So all that to say, in my new role at King's, I'm interested in how far I can push this idea of deliberately designing non-human AI. But this isn't a presentation about that, so I'll leave it there for now. Finally, to finish off, what are some broader issues that these technologies raise? And I say technologies because clearly creative AI is not just one thing. The field has always questioned what the creative act actually is. John Myhill wrote in 1950 that it is in the presetting of the controls of the machine that the freedom or individuality of the artist expresses itself. In other words, you could think of the system itself as the creative act and the pieces it produces as kind of ephemera that result from it. Xenakis wrote in 1971 in slightly more fantastical terms that with the aid of electronic computers, the composer becomes a sort of pilot. He presses the buttons, introduces coordinates, and supervises the controls of a cosmic vessel sailing in the space of sound across sonic constellations and galaxies that he could formerly glimpse only as a distant dream. And this is a really interesting quote for me because it not only makes the point about where the creative act sits, but crucially how a person interacts with it. Which gets back to thinking about interactions with musical instruments earlier as well. Many commercial Gen AI systems afford the user quite little control over the workings of the system, except by typing prompts. And this to me feels very different to piloting a cosmic vessel. At best, the user of that kind of system could be a passenger who can say where they want to get off, but is nowhere near the cockpit. This issue of control, trust, and interaction between humans and intelligent machines is very important in many fields, and music is an ideal space in which to test different approaches. It can be a kind of dress rehearsal for the rest of life. And then there are questions of how creative or Gen AI affects the creative ecosystem. There's been a lot of pushback on Gen AI recently for training on copyrighted data that companies didn't have legal access to, or at least that it wasn't clear that they had legal access to. Many systems, by the way, now do have that right very recently after striking lucrative deals with record labels. However, the focus on copyright tends to ignore the fact that most musical recordings are not owned by artists at all, but by labels. Abiding by copyright laws doesn't necessarily mean that artists get any more say about their work being used or not. I think lots of the public isn't aware of this fact. Historically, record labels are not particularly generous entities towards artists, and at the moment it can feel to many like being stuck between a rock and a hard place. You could raise a similar point about Gen AI systems to only use work licensed with Creative Commons, a type of license which means other people can use your work in their work. Often, enterprises that use CC licenses are at pains to point out that they are more ethical than working with copyrighted data without permission. And in one sense, I think this is probably true. However, you have to ask, did artists really mean that companies could train Gen AI systems on their music when they released it with this kind of license? In many cases, decades ago. Would they have done so if they knew what the future had in store? So that's to say, copyright is not the be-all and end-all in the fight to get artists recompense and allow them to choose whether they want their work to be used in this way. I think there are musical acts that this new landscape is going to encourage, things that are live, local, and very human, like going to a basement bar for an intense jazz gig, or I hope seeing 80 people working together in a symphony orchestra is a very human experience, and so on. We shouldn't underestimate, however, the effect of unregulated creative AI on these acts too. Many musicians, especially orchestral musicians, might subsist on session work for films, TV shows, and so on, and this in effect subsidizes the resource-intensive performance work they do. So if that bedrock is eroded, we could see significant knock-ons in places you wouldn't expect. So those are a couple of the problems that we face. However, I do think they are all surmountable problems that can be overcome with interdisciplinary work. Once we do surmount them, I hope we'll be left with reaping the creative benefits of what is one of the most consequential technological advancements in history. AI in music can be compared in this way to other huge advancements, the printing press, the radio, the internet. All of these had a profound effect on how we make, share, and think about music, and all of them upset creative ecosystems and required diligent and collaborative work to draw out all the benefits for as many people as possible. All of them, I think, have ultimately been good for music, but we didn't get there without putting in a lot of work and working across disciplines with artists, in addition to making, showcasing, and shouting about the kind of direction we might want this technology to go in. So thank you very much for listening. That brings me to the end of my talk. These are some references that you might be interested in if you want to follow up on anything else, and I'll look forward to any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a wonderful tour of so many topics in creative AI for music. I failed to mention this earlier, but those of you who are watching this, if you click on the Q&A next to the chat icon, you will be able to type in your question for Robert, and we will now have a Q&A session. Okay, so while people look for their Q&A tab, and we'll let everyone have a moment to put in their questions.
I'm seeing a lot of messages that said no sound. Did that referred to before I fixed it, did it?
Yes, that was before you
Yeah,
fixed
great.
it.
Okay,
Yes.
good. There's about 10 people on the chat saying that.
On the chat, I only see one saying that. Do you see Q&As? Oh, yes. We have the first question. So let me read it out. Earlier in your talk, you mentioned using AI to create new sounds that have never been heard before. In the audio samples you played for us, I'm not sure I heard any sounds I couldn't identify with a known acoustic instrument, voice, or synthesizer. What might you point to as truly new sounds that have been created using creative AI?
Yeah, good question. Thank you. I think that the best example for any new sounds would be the kind of latent space approach that I mentioned earlier. In fact, I have my little magnet instrument here. I can't play it for you at the moment because it's not plugged in. And yeah, so possibly the extract of music that I played on the latent space was maybe not the best for looking at new sounds because it was deliberately trained on orchestral archives and it was supposed to sound like an orchestra that was slowly being taken apart. But one of the really interesting things that you can do with this kind of machine learning is take data sets which are quite different sounds actually that would occupy very different spots in that latent space and then explore the moments in between where these sounds are sort of merged together in uncanny ways. And I think that there's actually quite a lot of uncanny sounds that that you might might find in those sort of odd corners of latent spaces. I mean, you've said that you couldn't find any sounds that you couldn't identify with a known instrument, voice, or synthesizer. And it's actually quite difficult to imagine a sound that you couldn't make with those things that you're not also discovering with AI. So it's often actually different ways to approach the same kind of sound. You might end up in the end as well. You might get to a sound using some kind of concatenative synthesis, for example, that you could also reach using a completely different algorithm. Yeah, I would say probably looking on the EarCam website for people who've used Rave in different ways might point you somewhere in that direction.
Yeah. I'm going to combine two questions next. So that previous one was by William Howarth. Next, I'm going to combine questions by Isaac Smith and an anonymous user. So Isaac asks, for the 8-dimensional controller, is it also listening to audio, or is all of the input coming from the 4 magnetic fields? An anonymous user follows up with, it appears that AI is highly stochastic. How much actual control does the composer have, or is it actually closer to improvisation?
Okay, yeah, thank you. So the first question, the answer to this is both. So the way that particular algorithm works is it has an encoder and a decoder, and it's the decoder that makes the sounds, as it were. And you can provide coordinates to the decoder using the magnetic fields, but you can also encode sounds, and then encoding it basically also turns them into coordinates, if you like, and then provide those in real time to the decoder as well. And in fact, in the piece, what you actually heard, where the orchestra plays some music and then the soloist sort of takes it over and plays on the instrument, is we've taken like a loop of what the orchestra has just played, an audio loop, and fed that into the decoder. So what Rave is trying to do is perfectly reconstruct what it's just heard, which again actually goes back to William's question, which is why it doesn't sound that new at the start of that cadenza. So it's looping that round, and then the magnets are perturbing those coordinates. So they're applying multiplications and divisions and then putting them together in interesting ways. And then as the cadenza goes along, we remove the looped audio encoding and just end up with the magnets, which take full control of the latent space. So you can do both. Yeah, the second question about stochastic music, or how much actual control does the composer have? This really depends on what system you're using and what piece you're writing. So, for example, in Techno Utopia, most of Zubin's part is completely notated, but he has some control over the actual timbres of the sounds using machine learning. So there's a sense that it's sort of semi-improvised, at least in some aspects, but then some parts are really sort of absolutely tight with the orchestra. I mean, this question of is it closer to improvisation? If you're using a system that's generating a piece, a symbolic generative system that's generating all the notes for a piece, I really struggle to find the difference between composition and improvisation in that context, because I don't know what that means for a computer. So like I said, in George Lewis's Voyager system, or some earlier pieces that I wrote that use symbolic work, it's really interesting. Like, at what point do you compose so fast that it's improvisation or not? So it really depends on the model you're using.
Okay, we have a series of questions about the humans in this process. So I'm just going to list a couple. They're short questions, so I'm just going to read them out loud. So Petru Andre says, what's your take on user autonomy and the role of AI in this technological relation, which is related to what you just answered? And Sukjun Kim said, perhaps you've touched on this, but how do you figure the presence or role of audiences, listeners, in your creative exploration? How do you think your exploration of music and AI will lead to different ways in which we listen in the future? And still on the human side of things, anonymous user asked, when you work with the BBC Philharmonic, I wondered about the acceptance and perception of the orchestra players playing with the AI system. How did they react to it?
Yeah, I'll take that last one first, otherwise I'll forget.
Yes.
This is something I get asked a lot, as you might imagine, and it's something that's really, really important to this aspect of the work, that orchestral musicians feel like they might have a stake in this, feel like they're comfortable with this technology, but also feel like their expertise is truly valuable in developing something that's interesting. Now, I had the benefit when I was working with the BBC Phil on Techno Utopia that I did my PhD in collaboration with this orchestra as well. So this was maybe the third full orchestra piece I'd written for them, and then I'd worked with a few individual members as well on different projects. So by that point, they sort of knew who I was and trusted that I was trying to do something that at least was sort of interesting in that way. And that was really valuable. And building up that level of trust is quite difficult, but I think it's really important for all sides of this relationship. I think there's too much of maybe sort of industrial enterprises assuming they know what it is that musicians want from this technology and then not involving them in conversation or sort of development. So it's something that you have to think very, very carefully about when you work with orchestral musicians who are rightly suspicious about technology taking their work like film composition and things like that. Okay, the first question was, what is the take on user autonomy, wasn't it? And yeah, this is, as I said in the talk, I think it's really important to give users lots of flexibility and feel like they have a real impact on what the system is doing. I think that often brings people back to these tools as opposed to just having people use it once or twice just for a sort of laugh and putting it aside. And I would say that all of the systems I talked about have extreme levels of user autonomy. Now, this, of course, intersects with how difficult they are technically to actually use, to download, install, and make it work. And so there can often be quite a big gulf that people are really interested in these systems, but they don't have the technical skills. But there are places which are making interesting instruments and systems which do let more or less anyone, if they're willing to put in a couple of hours work learning some things, use them. RNCM Prism that I mentioned earlier, all the tools on their site are pretty well documented. So yeah, you didn't really ask about documentation, but it actually is a question of documentation, because the more autonomy you have, the more documentation you need to know how it works. And what was this last one? I'm sorry. Oh, the audiences and listeners from, yeah, thank you. Yeah, all this work is really intended to be heard live. Usually, I think that's really important. I really believe in live music making as a space to explore and think about and reorient our relationships with technologies and with each other and with the sort of kind of world that we live in. A lot of these pieces are really long as well, or quite long. And I do actually believe in live performance as a space where you can go and you have a long form thing that maybe our attention spans can't actually deal with always, but you're welcome to sort of drop in and out, and it's and you're doing it with other people. I really, really believe that. I mean, the role of audiences is really interesting in a project like Techno Utopia, because they're actually in the data set of audience applause. You can go and find it on the magnet instrument. You can hear the audiences applauding previous concerts, or at least what the model is making of that. I really loved that intersection there. I'd like to do more with things that actually involve audiences. Even I'd love to have an audience member come and sort of perform with an ensemble sometime.
Great. Moving on, the next set of questions, the group of questions, have to do with the details of the music. How do you feel about AI potentially moving incidental sounds of music making, the breaths, key clicks, bow noises, which are natural in the orchestra environment? So that's one. The second one, so that was a previous one's question from Leanne. Next one is Jessica Keating. Using TUI as post-singularity songs and Techno Utopia as examples, can you share a bit more about your compositional toolkit for shaping the relationship between the human and non-human? What do you tend to pre-compose? What do you tend to fix? the materials, the form, the pacing? What do you leave adaptive? What do you make variable? That's a big question. But and William has a related question to these musical details. When an AI music generator is trained on a large data set of recordings, does it recognize patterns such as equal temperament or frequently occurring time signatures like 4/4 and generate sounds accordingly? Do such parameters need to be set explicitly as rules for it to follow? What other musical features that we take for granted that an AI might not perceive, and vice versa? I can mention bits of this, again.
These are all actually just really wonderful questions, and they okay, so the first one about AI potentially removing incidental sounds. So this is a very real thing that I'm very interested in, as you will have noticed from me including just the incidental sounds in post-singularity songs. I actually did a previous orchestra piece called Silicon, in which I trained a sample by sample neural synthesis model, which provided the orchestral sounds, if you like, or timbres and notes and rhythms and things like that. And the orchestra were all playing sort of these incidental sounds. They were all sort of blowing into the instruments and making big sort of gestures with their bows. So you had one was the visual and one was the sound. I think it's a really important question, but I guess my initial response, we can talk about this at length another time, but my initial response is these are not noises that AI has removed necessarily. AI only learns from data sets, and it's long been standard practice, not in classical, but in many other genres, to remove the sounds of someone breathing, to remove incidental sounds, to remove fretwork sounds from bass guitars, and all these types of things. That's a really common thing to happen in the studio, and AI is kind of responding to that. So yes, it does erase them because incidental sounds are not well represented in a data set, so they are not represented in the outputs, but also they're sometimes not in the data set at all, even if they're not represented well. The second question, the relationship, what do you tend to pre-compose and fix, and what do you leave adaptive or variable? I'm very structurally interested in my music, and often I'll have an idea of the kind of overall form that I might like to interrogate. And usually I'm interested in writing a particular piece about a particular topic, and I'll go looking for a kind of technology that will help achieve that. However, that to say, what do you leave adaptive or variable? One thing I've been getting better at, I think, is making more time in the process to respond to what these adaptive systems actually sort of offer. So not just how can they achieve what I wanted to do, but also how can they have a sort of structural impact. So it actually becomes a really recursive compositional process that's quite complex. And I do write everything on manuscript paper, you might be interested to know. So I'm quite interested in kind of slowing down that process as well, and thinking about decision making in that sort of quite deliberate, pencil-y way. So yeah, I mean, maybe just to give one example, like Techno Utopia, I knew that I wanted a certain kind of structure because I wanted the first movement to look at questions to do with erasure and relentless algorithms. I wanted the last movement to look at memory and what our memory of music means. And yet how the material filled those was quite different. And I think my third movement was maybe better than the first movement because I listened more to the instruments I'd made by that point in the process. And the last one,
William,
does it recognize patterns such as equal temperament or time signature? This is a great question. This actually gets onto that sort of human, non-human thing I was talking about as well. How far do you force the system to conform to anthropomorphic norms of music making? So it depends which type of algorithm you're looking at. That earlier work from the 50s, 60s, that will have had stuff pre-ground in to say you will write in this time signature. These are the kinds of intervals you might use. And then it populates that with sort of random choices and then checks itself against those rules. And that's where you get the music from. Modern systems, the kind that I use, don't have those. So you're really allowing it to make what it will of the data you give it. You don't give it any preconceptions, except of course in the fact that architectures have their own biases built in, even if you don't tell them what different time signatures are. it might be something that does or doesn't listen for time signatures at all. So that's that sort of middle part of the diagram that I showed in terms of data design and intent. That's really that design part. That's why I'm really interested in using like bird brains as a as a basis for making AI systems rather than human brains, because they hear meter and rhythm in a very different and very constrained way, which is quite interesting. That said, Gen AI models, commercial ones, they use several layers to achieve this. So they have a symbolic layer which knows all about time signatures and textures in the traditional sense of textures like homophonic and monophonic. And that feeds into a sound making layer which doesn't necessarily know any of those facts or details, but is able to it knows how to turn notes into sounds. You see what I mean? So there could be several layers of algorithms working together, which to me shows how far you have to go to make these things anthropomorphic rather than just letting it do its own thing. Yeah, that's a very quick answer there.
Well, if we have a couple minutes, there's just one last lot of questions having to do with AI systems. Polomi asks, your talk was very informative. Thank you. Could you elaborate on the topic of music generation using NLP or LLMs, natural language processing, or large language models a little bit? Moving up, Jessica's second question is, I'm interested in sound in VR worlds. I was wondering if AI has reached a point of being able to integrate sounds into VR worlds using AI. And finally, Chen Wang congratulates you. That's a brilliant talk. And Cher, thank you, especially for your work with the BBC Orchestra. I'm quite interested in your experience with working in the industry because I just finished a full music production composition with AI generated tools as well last month, just premiered in Beijing, China. After the show, there is a talk as well as with the professionals in industry. However, quite surprisingly, at the moment, the industry is still a bit quite anti-AI, based on the copyright or the face to the market, to the audience. So I'd like to know your thoughts. So there's a question about what you think of LLMs and natural language processing for AI, a question about AI for virtual reality and music, and one question about industry.
Yeah, thank you. This question about natural language processing is such a huge area, and I have to say it's not my exact area of expertise. Nonetheless, there are many different approaches that this can be done with. I mean, all of them involve this sort of layers of how data interacts with each other. So what you're typing in will be, transformed into sort of tokens that go into one space, like mathematical space, which then sort of goes through many layers and then eventually makes something which relates to music and then sort of comes back. So what I'm trying to say is it uses the same kinds of, or many of these systems use the same kind of structures as GPT structures like ChatGPT. In fact, they are lots of them are sort of based on transformer models. There's also diffusion models, which I mentioned a little bit of, which are really interesting. And you sort of type something in, and through metadata normally and YouTube comments and things like this, companies or researchers have associated words with audio, and they've done this with a very large amount of data. And as you type your prompt in, it sort of guides the system towards something that it thinks is a sort of believable match for the words that you've typed in based on the metadata. I'm sorry, I don't have, this is a huge topic. It's very difficult to get into in 1 minute. But yeah, you might like to look at, either those transformer-based systems. There's an interesting one from Google actually a few years ago, Music LM, which is kind of interesting, and diffusion-based ones as well, which is what things like Suno and Udio, I think, use diffusion-based. VR worlds and integrating sounds into VR worlds using AI. Yes, in a way there are. I don't know too much about this, but my colleague Chris Rhodes at UCL runs a lab that looks at this kind of exact question. So you might like to look into his lab. Yes, work has been done on this, but whether it's been done commercially for actual large-scale VR video games, I don't know yet. I haven't heard about it yet, but that doesn't mean it hasn't happened. It's slightly outside of my area, but certainly it's been happening in research fields for some time. So yeah, you might like to look into that. I mean, one of the things is, what are you actually doing with AI in a VR world? What does it actually offer that you don't already have from binaural listening and things like that? I mean, I think in terms of video games, there are some interesting places that AI could go in terms of maybe adapting music to your exact actions in a very specific way, which could be quite interesting. And then this last question, you said you were quite surprised that the industry is quite anti-AI. So I'm surprised that you're surprised, I suppose, is is my one of my responses to this. I think that the many people in the music industry are they're just not technical experts, and they don't know anything about this technology except through what's in the headlines. And they might not be aware that AI has a kind of a long and interesting history that isn't just this very recent stuff to do with copyright. I found that on the whole, for every orchestra that's interested in my work, there are probably 3 that don't want to go anywhere near the word AI, for example. And that could be because they aren't interested in doing that, because they don't think that their audiences will come along, because they don't have the resources or time to build up that level of trust that we talked about in terms of the BBC Philharmonic earlier. So some of these questions are ones that you can sort of work at, and some of them are a bit more difficult. However, there is also a motion within the music industry, at least in this country, to recognize that sometimes there has been too much conservatism. For example, streaming, orchestras and music industry as a whole didn't really jump onto that quite right, and there was a lot of sort of piracy related things in the early 2000s, which there's lots of people who wish, oh, maybe we should have jumped on this earlier. And then there are other technologies that are related, like making sample libraries for film composers is quite a controversial thing in the past for orchestras to have done, because in one sense you are doing yourself out of work, because now composers don't need to hire an orchestra to have orchestral sounds. On the other hand, are you just adapting to the sort of modern technological environment? So it's a really big topic, and I know that there are lots of talks about this at like the IVORs and the MU and like the Association of British Orchestras, all sorts of institutions in this country.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much, Robert. That was a tour de force through so many questions, answers, and all the things that you've shared. That was amazing. So thank you again for being all those who are out there in the internet. Thank you for being here. And so I think that concludes our session for today. And really looking forward to following your work, Robert, as you continue your fellowship here at King's.
Thank you very much, everyone, for coming.